with income from sources within the United States, to provide tax relief with respect to certain federal disasters, to make improvements to low-income housing tax credit, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, and the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, will each control 20 minutes. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Claim time in actual opposition to the bill.
The chair would ask if the gentleman from Massachusetts is opposed.
I'm not opposed to it.
To the bill.
Yeah. No, I'm not opposed to the legislation, no.
You're not claiming time in opposition.
I'm not claiming I'm in opposition, that's the point.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, and the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and submit extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act is pro-growth, pro-jobs, pro-American. The legislation locks in $600 billion in pro-growth tax policies by restoring 3 key provisions from President Trump's successful 2017 tax reform that have a proven record of creating millions of jobs, raising workers' wages, and sparking more investment and economic growth right here at home. This bill restores full R&D expensing, interest deductibility, and 100% expensing. Each of these policies will help American businesses grow, create jobs, and sharpen their competitive advantage against China. This will create over $70 billion in new R&D investment and over 900,000 new jobs, increase small business investment by $400 billion, and generate $58 billion in additional take-home pay for American workers. Today, America's small businesses are being pummeled by high prices and interest rates. This package raises the expensing cap for small businesses beyond the limit set in the 2017 tax reform, and it cuts paperwork for those small businesses by updating the IRS form last changed when Eisenhower was president. Not only are we helping businesses here at home, but this tax relief package also ensures America is standing with our key economic partner, Taiwan, by ending double taxation on American workers and businesses operating in both countries. The child tax credit provisions reflect the same structure established by the 2017 tax reform. We maintain work requirements while enhancing the benefit to support families crushed by today's inflation, and remove the penalty for families with multiple children. It's both pro-worker and pro-family. The reforms include meaningful tax relief for those affected by natural and man-made disasters and encourage more construction of safe, affordable housing. At the end of the day, we are replacing bad tax policy with good tax policy by cutting off funding for the Employee Retention Tax Credit, a COVID-era program that cost 6 times its original amount and is so riddled with fraud that the IRS put it on its dirty dozen list of the worst scams in America. This will save America taxpayers over $75 billion. There's a reason that over 450 groups representing Americans from all walks of life support this legislation. That includes job creators, those supporting workers and families, and those defending the right to life. It's a strong, common sense, bipartisan step forward in providing urgent tax relief for working families and small businesses. Parents in Main Street communities across this country will see lower taxes, more opportunity, and greater financial security after we pass this legislation. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do rise in opposition to this legislation, and I do so reluctantly because I know of the significant amount of work by my friend from Missouri, by those, frankly, on both sides of the aisle to reach agreement, my friends on Ways and Means, important provisions in this legislation that are critical for job growth, for economic growth, critical for the well-being of our country. Numerous businesses I know in Texas and around this country that understand the importance of the expensing provisions, the interest provisions, research and development. But unfortunately, as happens in this town, this legislation comes with provisions that, frankly, the people I represent are tired of. And it's provisions that would continue to expand the welfare state, as the Wall Street Journal editorialized about, by expanding the child tax credit in ways that will continue to fund people directly through refundable credits, which we find to be problematic. And we think undermines the kind of economic activity and incentive to work and incentive to produce value that we think is critically important for economic growth. But importantly, that provision is also available to parents who are here in this country illegally of children born in the United States. We think that's a problem. We think that is not just allowing essentially birthright citizenship anchor babies, but funding it. That's a problem. Now, my colleagues on this side of the aisle will rejoin that that was a product of the 2017 bill that was pushed by and passed by Republicans, including President Trump, to which I say, right, so what? It's still wrong. It's still bad policy. We shouldn't do it. And we should not be perpetuating it now. All through the 11th hour last night, I worked hard trying to find a way to come up with a provision that might be palatable on both sides of the aisle, this side of the aisle, to find a way to say, let's get that provision pulled off so we can move the pieces that will be good for economic growth and prosperity that I think has bipartisan support and clearly support on this side of the aisle. Unfortunately, we have not done that. And I'm getting a lot of correspondence from people that I represent who are sick of the same old game in this town, who are sick of saying we're just going to keep doing the same thing, and we're going to, in this case, again, continue to expand the welfare state, and in this case, do so in a way in which it entices people to be in the United States illegally, benefit from being here illegally, and do so at a time when we have a heightened level of illegal traffic into the United States, 300,000 people crossing the border in December, millions who have crossed under this president, and we're now in the middle of that crisis going to continue to fuel the fire. I think that is a mistake. I think it is a mistake for the country. I think it is a mistake on policy, and I think it is a mistake politically. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of this tax bill. I'm particularly pleased this bill includes language that I introduced to ensure capital-intensive industries can fully deduct the cost of interest from their taxes. This is particularly important right now as Americans continue to deal with recent high inflation and higher interest rates. Alongside provisions ensuring domestic research and development and small business capital expenses are fully deductible, this bill enhances the opportunity to develop new products in America, create jobs making those products here, and then sell those products around the world. I'm also glad this bill includes language ensuring Americans living, working, and investing in companies within our ally Taiwan do not face double taxation. And I especially appreciate the language of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act applying to the child tax credit is continued in this bill. Mr. Speaker, this is a strong bill. It deserves strong bipartisan support. I look forward to voting for it. I urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that debate on the pending motion be extended by 20 minutes to be controlled by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal.
Is there objection? Yes. Objection is heard.
What do you do? I guess.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will yield such time as he shall consume to the gentleman from Florida.
The gentleman is recognized.
To the extent that this is a tax bill, there are good provisions in it on business expensing for economic growth. But my friends, this is not a tax bill. This is a welfare bill masquerading as a tax bill. The Wall Street Journal was correct to identify the ways in which this legislation vastly expands the welfare state. And so this is how the bipartisan agreement came together. If the Republicans were willing to give the Democrats what they wanted for illegal aliens to get massive subsidies in welfare, then the Democrats were willing to give the Republicans what they wanted on a bunch of business welfare. The child tax credit, as currently contemplated, will be a massive pull factor to bring people into this country illegally. And we could have, as the majority party, demanded constraints to stop them from being able to use the money that way, but bipartisanship was more important than good policy. And as my friend from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, noted recently, if you aren't paying taxes and you get a refundable tax credit in the form of a check, that's not a tax cut. That's not even tax policy. That's just welfare. That's just giving people money that didn't initially pay it in, and a bunch of them are here illegally. But it's not just a welfare bill in that respect. It's also corporate welfare. These R&D tax credits that they've put in there are so targeted, they're bought and paid for by the lobbyists who fund their campaigns and give them donations, and it is entirely wrong. We should have a flat tax code, and the R&D tax credits that they're putting in are deeply misguided. They continue to distort the economy, and frankly, it's just another flavor of a lot of the Green New Deal tax credits that you act like you're against. But indeed, Mr. Speaker, that is not the case. This is not a tax bill. It is a welfare bill in drag, and that may be appealing to some of the proponents. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Neal from Massachusetts.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is not the bill I would have written, but this is sensible policy. There is no denying the fact, despite what the two previous speakers have said, that 16 million children will benefit immediately from the expansion of the child tax credit. This is not welfare. Addressing childhood poverty in America ought to be a priority for us every single day. Low-income housing tax credit, it's sound policy. Our economy grew 3.1% last year, thanks in some measure to Joe Biden's economic policies. I can't believe that we would stand here tonight and sit here tonight and hear that addressing childhood poverty is welfare. The number of children in America who live outside of the mainstream because of concerns that they did not create tells much of the whole story. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation, not perfection. It's not what I would have written, but this is a decent tax package to go forward.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I would yield 1 minute to my colleague from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
The gentleman is recognized.
This corporate tax windfall bill, thinly disguised as help for children, offers even more tax advantages to corporations that are paying today a mere 7.8% tax rate. A working mother of two, earning the average wage, pays a federal effective rate of 20%. Even the Wall Street Journal called one provision in this bill a retroactive SOP. Minimal help for children, maximum benefits for those who are failing to pay their fair share. For every $1 that goes to children under this bill, $5 to corporations. Republicans are enabled to lock in $600 billion in extended Trump tax breaks, while millions of children are left in preventable poverty, denied a full tax credit. While bipartisan, this bill is no more equitable than our broken bipartisan tax code, overflowing with loopholes and special advantages for the well-connected. This deal only continues slanting our tax system against working families. Reject the unjustified corporate ransom and lock in genuine relief for children. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. LaHood.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for negotiating this good monumental tax bill. I particularly want to highlight the inclusion of two affordable housing provisions in the bill, provisions that stem from my bill, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which has garnered the support of 212 co-sponsors in the House, equally divided between Republicans and Democrats. We are facing an affordable housing crisis in this country. LIHTC, strengthening the low-income housing tax credit established by Ronald Reagan, is key in this and will be very successful to bridging the gap to more affordable housing in this country. I urge a yes vote on this very good tax bill. I yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri reserve. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I would like to yield such time as the gentleman shall consume to my friend from Kentucky.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank the gentleman from Texas. Look, there's something in this bill called tax credits, but they're also called refundable. So what is a refundable tax credit? It's welfare by a different name. We are going to give cash payments, checks, to people who don't even pay taxes. The hardworking constituents that I represent in Kentucky are tired of getting up at 6 a.m., driving an hour or two to work, working their hind ends off, to watch their neighbors collect these checks, of which there will be more of after this bill. It's just wrong. Now, does anybody find it interesting that the Democratic leadership has not even claimed time in opposition to this bill? Why is that? Why aren't they opposed? Now, there are a few Democrats opposed. Maybe some don't think it goes far enough, or some are opposed to what they call corporate welfare in here. But by and large, the Democrats are not opposed to this because this is an expansion of the welfare state. That is what it is. So here's my concern about that. You know, is it mean to give away money? No, it's not mean. Oh, we could consider it compassionate until you think about the implications. Now, this tax bill, they say it's paid for. What does that mean? What does it mean when it's paid for? There's some gimmicks in here that are not going to reduce the debt. This is actually going to cost. Now, by Washington, D.C. math, it's paid for. But when you look at the debt, when you look at the national debt, it will go up as a result of this bill. Everybody in here knows it. We know these are gimmicks when you call it a pay for. This bill will increase our debt. What's that going to do? It's going to cause inflation to go up. That's going to affect everybody, including the people you're trying to give the money to for having kids. This is bad policy. I'm opposed to it, and I urge a no vote, and I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentle lady from Washington, Ms. Del Bene.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The tax bill we're considering today contains several wins for families and our economy, but one piece falls short. The child tax credit expansion would still leave behind millions of kids and families that need it the most. Democrats offered a solution proven to cut child poverty in half, but unfortunately Republicans rejected that. I'll still continue leading the effort to fully expand the child tax credit, invest in our children, and lift up families. And while today's bill is imperfect, it does include policies I've championed, including the largest expansion of the low-income housing tax credit in several decades, and policies to reduce double taxation on American and Chinese workers. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
May I inquire how much time remaining?
And has 12 minutes.
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker. And sort of elementary school economics, dozen things have been said here absolutely wrong. If you look at the 2017 tax reform, where did we get the greatest economic boost, least amount of cost? It was actually the R&D and the expensing. We actually have models that there make it perfectly clear the expensing actually was the one portion of the tax reform that actually paid for itself. Because in a higher interest rate world, and I believe higher interest rates came from Democrat spending, but that's a different discussion, the fact of the matter is you do research and development, you have to finance it. Making it this is where you get the economic growth that actually knocks down inflation and makes our society more prosperous. Good bill.
Does the gentleman reserve?
Reserve.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with my Democratic colleagues that the child tax credit portion of this bill should be stronger. But in a divided government, you don't always get exactly what you want. And this bill is an improvement over the status quo. I'm especially pleased at the inclusion of my legislation providing critical relief to wildfire survivors, which passed the Ways and Means Committee unanimously. I urge my colleagues to pass this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman reserve?
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I would yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I always support good faith efforts to improve our nation's tax code, and I don't oppose reasonable benefits for the American businesses that drive economic growth and strength. But I can't support a bill that provides generous tax breaks to large corporations while offering minimal tax relief for working families. Republicans have refused again and again to enact Democratic tax writers' proposals that would enact a more generous version of the poverty-busting child tax credit. Under President Biden's American Rescue Plan, the child tax credit lifted millions of kids out of poverty and helped their families buy groceries, pay for health care, and cover their rent. As a mother and a legislator, I will never stop fighting on behalf of our country's poorest babies and children and the moms, dads, grandparents, and other caregivers who raise them. Unfortunately, I will have to vote against this tax scheme because I, for one, recognize that working families matter or should matter just as much as businesses. And I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Ferguson.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of this piece of legislation. I do not worry one single bit about making sure that American business is more competitive on the global stage, making sure that our businesses are competitive through research and development, and then having the capital to turn those ideas into a product that turns those products into jobs here in America is something that we should be doing. Staying competitive against our adversaries on the global stage is something that we should be doing. This is not about giving business a tax break. This is about investing in America and American jobs. And the complete mischaracterization about the child tax credit is the most intellectually dishonest conversation that I have heard on this floor in a very long time. This is about making sure that people that work and their families have the ability to get ahead. But let me tell you something. We all believe on this side of the aisle that you should work in order to receive federal benefits. That is something that this bill does.
Gentleman's time has expired.
15 seconds, Mr. Chairman, because I think it's important to
recognize that 15 seconds. 15 seconds.
The gentleman from Florida just characterized this bill, which is the child tax credit piece, which is something that President Trump signed into law, is giving people that are here illegally a check. I hate to see that mischaracterization from my colleague from Florida about President Trump's signature bill. I yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
That's my bad. Sorry.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Larson.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of this bill and especially want to commend my colleague, Ron Estes, for working directly on this R&D tax credit. And what you're hearing today on this floor is what happens when we work and pull together. We're in a race with China, and we better be well aware of what we have to do with R&D because that's critical to it. I also want to commend Rosa DeLauro, who you'll hear from as well. And I want to thank Dr. Ferguson for what you had to say just about the child tax credit and how important that is. It's
has expired.
Children need to be protected.
Does the gentleman reserve? Reserve. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yield such time as he consumes to the gentleman from Florida.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
If my characterization of the child tax credit is intellectually dishonest, I'd love to hear the warrant behind that claim, because none of my colleagues can state how a huge sum of this money is not going to end up in the hands of illegal immigrants. And when it comes to evaluating that context in the era of Trump versus the era of Biden, it is somewhat embarrassing that I would have to remind a Republican colleague that it's the Biden administration that's let in 10 million additional people, which vastly blows out the cost of this particular endeavor. Under Trump, you didn't have an open border, so there was less a concern about drawing more people here illegally through this child tax credit. I yield back.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentle lady from Texas, Ms. Van Dyne.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I rise in support of the Tax Relief for American Families Act. This is actually paid for. It will extend the Trump-era tax cuts that brought us record employment, economic growth, and wages that grew at a rate nearly 5% higher than inflation. If we do not make these important reforms to our tax code, my home state of Texas will lose more than 8,000 jobs and nearly $700 million in wages. Importantly, this bill will maintain Trump-era safeguards and work requirements to the child tax credit to ensure that it only goes to American citizens, making it one of the few tax credits to actually have this strong requirement for block claims from illegal immigrants and non-citizens. I stand with North Texas families, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
The truth is, illegal immigrants are eligible for the CTC expansion because they can get an individual taxpayer identification number in lieu of a Social Security number. And in fact, in the USA Today, somebody who's a proponent of this actually opined and wrote in the USA Today, quote, how the child tax credit could lift undocumented immigrants out of poverty. That's just the truth. It's what we actually did in 2017. I don't care if my colleagues on this side of the aisle think that's a good idea. I don't care if they're willing to weigh that against what they believe is good for the corporate changes to the law, but don't try to snow the American people. That's what we're doing. And yet colleagues on this side of the aisle will thump their chest about being so great on the border. And yet the border's wide open. There's still 300,000 pouring across in December. Oh, what have we done? Have some votes. But we're still funding it. And here we're not just funding it, we're juicing it. We're actually encouraging it. We're supplementing it. We're saying, come on over here, have children, and get a tax credit. How is that policy that the American people want to support? I reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Listening on the floor of the House, there are arguments that are legitimate in terms of the shortcomings of this. It's not perfect, but I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. I don't want to deny 16 million children an opportunity for this federal support in order to make a point. I hope we'll come to the point where we're able to deal with tax policy in a more rational fashion. Under Chairman Neal, I think we will. But in the meantime, it's important to pass this legislation to meet the needs of American families.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I would yield such time as the gentleman shall consume to my friend from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Texas, and I applaud my colleagues on our side of the aisle for working hard to try and return some of the money to hardworking people. I'm always for that. If you're working, you should keep the money that you earn, whether you're corporate or whether you're individual. But here's where I have a problem, this refundable tax credit. See, my folks get up every day. They get up early. It's usually dark. They put their kids on the school bus and they go to work to afford their bills. By the way, which they can barely afford right now. They can't afford their groceries, their gasoline, their credit card bills. They can't afford them because the federal government is flooding the economy with money. And we're getting ready to flood more because, ladies and gentlemen, regardless of what anybody thinks, if you're here illegally with a Social Security number, you're going to get the money. Now, I got a news flash for you. Little kids don't get the check sent to them even though they got a Social Security number. but there are parents who are here illegally do. And it's going to happen by the millions. And my folks, the folks that are working hard to put food on their table, are tired of paying for that. We should reject this. I yield the balance.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman who has led the legislation and research and development, Mr. Ron Estes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start by thanking Chairman Smith for his tireless work on this tax package that we're about to pass. American families and small businesses are in desperate need of economic relief. High cost of goods and services and burdensome regulations have strained pocketbooks and the economy, and Americans need a break. The Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act provide the wins we need. This bill includes a provision that I've been advocating for, the immediate R&D expensing. Without this, we've seen the growth rate of R&D spending slow. And since 3/4 of R&D spending is on wages and salaries, R&D amortization is primarily a jobs issue. Countless Kansas small businesses expressed their grave concern about this expired provision. And I'm glad we're taking a positive step to restore immediate R&D expensing. I yield back.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I would yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Wisconsin.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you so much. Do you all remember when our good friend Mitt Romney talked about the 47% of the takers? This bill locks in the principle that we have takers and makers. We have $600 billion of permanent tax cuts to the wealthiest people. And yet some woman who gets up in a rural area and marches off to the grocery store and works 30 hours a week won't see a dime of this tax credit because she's too poor, because she's a taker. She's not a maker. And, you know, I think it's all right. This is a compromise bill. It's better than current law, where that same minimum wage worker would have to work 70 hours a week in order to get this tax credit. Now only has to work 40 hours a week, plus do a little Uber on the side to get the tax credit. So I think we need to compromise, but we don't need to capitulate. And I represent the 47% of those. We're going to expand this tax credit for poor children, but the poorest will be even poorer.
Does the gentleman from Texas reserve?
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act worked. It grew the economy, it increased revenue, and it helped every American family to achieve a better life. It also, for those in opposition to this bill, for the first time, required a Social Security number for a child, in order for a family to receive the child tax credit. Many who are in opposition to this bill today voted for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Are you telling me you regret that vote? This continues the provision to require children to have a Social Security number for the family to benefit from the child tax credit.
Does the gentleman from Missouri reserve?
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Can I inquire how much time we have remaining?
The gentleman has 6 minutes.
I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, gentlemen from Texas. Appreciate the time. Here we are again, where the minority party isn't even using their time to oppose the bill put forward by the majority. Just 2 weeks ago, the last major piece of legislation that we passed by suspension of the rules, the Democrat minority party voted for it 207-2. It'll be interesting tonight to see how many Democrats vote for this and how many Republicans vote for it. I'm against this because of the suspension of the rules, the process that we're using. I'm against it because of the expansion of the welfare state. I'm against it because of we're not correcting the fact that illegals can have access to the child tax credit. I've never done this on the House floor before, but I'm going to read what someone else wrote about this bill. And this is from Kevin Roberts with Heritage Foundation. I want to commend them for what they said. Quote, although the bill claims that its aim is to provide tax relief to families with children, it contains very little relief for working families. Instead, nearly 91% of the family benefits in this bill are cash welfare payments to families who pay no federal income taxes. The bill provides $306 billion in new welfare cash payments. Of these new cash welfare payments, if they were extended over 10 years, which is very likely, the total cost would be $140 billion. The Ways and Means bill moves toward fulfilling President Biden's aims. The bill embraces the premise and goals of the Biden's plan to greatly increase cash welfare payments, predominantly for single parents, while weakening the already porous work requirements. This bill obviously sets the ground for a future compromise that would fully enact the Biden Child Allowance Program. Overall, this portion of the Ways and Means bill represents an enormous political victory for President Biden. Under current law, illegal aliens who have children that were born in the U.S., and many do, can claim welfare payments from the additional child tax credit. The Ways and Means bill expands these welfare payments for millions of people who are in the U.S. illegally and for millions more entering in the future. The bill weakens welfare work requirements and continues a longstanding push by Congress to dress up welfare benefits as tax relief. And I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 30 seconds.
You know, I've been told that a half a loaf is better than none, but this isn't even a half a loaf. But I'm going to vote for it because our families and businesses need help. And while it does help, it does not create a 50% reduction in child poverty as we did in 2021. It's more like a deal than a bill, but I'm going to vote for it. I yield back.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as a result of President Trump's tax reform, our economy was strong, wages were up, unemployment was at all-time lows. We have a critical tax cliff fast approaching at the end of 2025, just 20 months from now, with the majority of President Trump's pro-growth policies expiring. Extending these expired provisions is not just an economic issue. One could argue this is a national security issue. Mr. Speaker, we can't expect to compete with China when it's more expensive to invest and innovate and grow here in the United States. I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill, which extends President Trump's pro-growth policy agenda and increases U.S. competitiveness and resilience against China's economic influence. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I would yield 1 minute to the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, Ms. DeLauro.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I cannot vote for a deal that so lopsidedly benefits big corporations while failing to ensure a substantial tax cut to middle and working class families. The deal is inequitable at a time when we have seen the greatest rise in inequality. Big corporations made super profits at the expense of the consumer. It's a mockery of who representative government works for. Massive tax cuts for the biggest corporations, denying middle class families the economic security they had under the expanded monthly child tax credit. Let us be unequivocal. This is a reversal of the largest middle class tax cut in history. This bill provides billions of dollars in tax relief for the wealthy, pennies for the poor. The biggest corporations, who have paid no federal income tax, are the beneficiaries of this deal. Big corporations are richer than ever. There is no even split. Families today live paycheck to paycheck, not seeing their wages keep up with rising costs. The economy is not working for them. The bill fails to improve the child tax credit, leaves millions of middle-class families without the tax cut they received in 2021, keeps millions of children in preventable poverty while giving biggest tax breaks to the biggest corporations. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you. I yield 30 seconds to the gentle lady from West Virginia, Ms. Miller.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend Chairman Smith for his diligent work. It's a huge win for working families, small businesses, and employers throughout our country. This has set the tone for the Ways and Means agenda, where we are able to make the best package possible. The child tax credit expansion will help working families while protecting the important guardrails that we fought so hard to ensure that the program is going to help Americans in need. I yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Alabama, Ms. Sewell.
The gentlelady is recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, Democrats today will make good on a promise to deliver tax relief for American families. This bill expands the child tax credit for 16 million children, including 280,000 children in Alabama. The tax credit is one of the most effective anti-poverty programs in the country and will again provide much-needed assistance to families throughout Alabama. This bill will also provide much-needed disaster tax relief to the families of the Black Belt, Dallas County, Hale County, Greene County, and Sumter County that fight to rebuild in the wake of last tornado. I ask my colleagues to support this measure.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe, the author of the disaster tax language.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In September 2022, my district in Southwest Florida was devastated by Hurricane Ian. Totaling over $112 billion in damages, Ian was the third costliest hurricane in American history and the most expensive ever to hit Florida. Over a year later, my constituents are still working towards rebuilding their lives. I introduced the Federal Disaster Tax Relief Act, which is included in this bill, to deliver relief for American families in 45 states who are victims of federally declared disasters. This includes victims of wildfires, chemical spills, hurricanes that have affected millions of Americans over the past several years. We should pass this important tax relief for victims of natural disasters. I urge my colleagues to support the legislation.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill is not perfect, but no bill ever is. But this act is win, win, win. 400,000 children will be lifted out of poverty. 200,000 new affordable homes will be built. And research and development, the absolute essential investment for economic prosperity, will be incentivized again. Politics is the art of the possible. In a divided Congress, this is the best we can accomplish. I urge a vote yes.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I want to just quote from the Wall Street Journal editorial last week about this bill. When it says up to $1,600 of the $2,000 credit is refundable, and the bipartisan bill would make $2,000 refundable by 2025. Now, in fairness, a $1,400 limit was tethered to inflation under the 2017 tax law, so it's increasing anyway. But the general point here, as it says, is at least admit this is income redistribution. It's not tax relief, it's income redistribution. The deal undermines the incentive to work in return for the credit. And the current credit has a small amount of income that's required, $2,500, to begin to claim it. That means it gives low-income Americans an incentive to work more, to earn more, which is good for them and their children. But this would allow parents to rely on the prior year's income to trigger the credit for 24 and 25, work 1 year, earn benefits for 2. The practical effect is to cut the work requirement in half, according to a report by the American Enterprise Institute. The fact is, the editorial closes, the business lobby wants the tax breaks. And by the way, this is the Wall Street Journal editorial. The business lobby wants the tax breaks, and some Democrats in Congress want them as well. But these policies ought to stand or fall on their merits, not on a political trade that will do more harm than good. I reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this legislation strengthens our workforce. I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record this report from experts at the Joint Committee on Taxation confirming that the child tax credit changes will have a net positive effect on jobs and workforce participation.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Moore.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the Relief for American Workers Act of 2024. Look, not a lot of legislation actually affects every single American. Today, we get a chance to actually pass a piece that does. We hear a lot of, folks back home hear a lot of the drama that we do, and they hear what gets put on the headlines. But never have I seen neighbors of mine, Little League coaches that I coach with, say, look, this is killer for my small business. Losing the R&D tax credit has destroyed my ability to grow my small business. This affects every single American and will be one of the most productive, positive, pro-growth tax policies that this Congress and Congresses to come will do. I yield back.
Does the gentleman from Missouri reserve? The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Davis.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized
Mr. Evans.
for 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to discuss an unappreciated part of this bill, improvement to the low-income housing tax credit. This is urgently needed. Millions of American families struggle to pay their rent or buy a house. We must do more. This bill is one step towards eliminating housing insecurity in America. I urge my colleagues to support it. We must make sure that no child goes without a roof over their head in this country. I will continue to work for the rally. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra.
The gentleman from Iowa is recognized for 30 seconons.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Agriculture is the economic engine of my district, and our tax policies must help our farmers grow, invest, and compete with China. This legislation does exactly that. Our farmers will benefit from two key provisions in this bill: 100% bonus depreciation and the expansion of Section 179 deduction limit. Our producers rely on these tools to buy farm equipment and invest in their operations. This legislation is a victory for our farmers and rural communities. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman in Illinois, Mr. Schneider.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I rise in support of this truly meaningful, bipartisan legislation that will benefit millions of needy children. This bipartisan bill is the most significant, if not the only significant legislation passed so far this Congress, helping lift kids out of poverty, lowering the tax burden for working families, supporting innovative businesses, and expanding the supply of affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, despite the exotic arguments of those opposed to this bill tonight they're trying to make, these are things we should all be proud of. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield the remainder of my time.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Malliotakis.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank Chairman Smith for his hard work on this and the entire committee. Trump's tax cuts created jobs. They lifted wages. They had led to 50-year lowest unemployment. Lifted millions from poverty. And today we're building on that success with pro-jobs, pro-growth, pro-family policies by extending these priorities and increasing the child tax credit as well. But we're also helping build affordable housing by expanding Reagan's initiatives. And we're enabling Taiwanese investment in semiconductor manufacturing here in the United States to further create jobs, enhance our supply chain, and reduce dependency on China. We still have so much work to do, and over the next 2 years, you'll see more tax policies coming out of this House, and I hope that we'll be able to increase the standard deduction, that we'll be able to provide some relief to state and local taxes in the form of SALT, and exempt our exempt more Social Security income from taxation to help our seniors who have not seen that change in 4 decades. So thank you everyone on this committee who worked so hard in a bipartisan manner to get this done. I look forward to seeing it pass in both houses.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 30 seconds.
This is a good bill. Tax credits for child care, immediate expensing for small businesses R&D, tax-free settlements for natural disasters, and yes, more affordable housing. This is a good bill, not just for my district, but for our country. And yes, for our country's faith in Congress's ability to actually affect the lives and livelihoods of all Americans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a letter signed by a dozen pro-life organizations, include Concerned Women for America, Susan B. Anthony, and the Eagle Forum, in support of this legislation and its important pro-family and pro-work provisions. Thank you. I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Americans across the nation will benefit from this pro-growth, pro-America bipartisan tax bill. The research and development provision will boost innovation here at home, making our nation much more competitive against China. Enhanced small business expensing will allow our community businesses to thrive and prosper. And finally, more than 500,000 children in my home state of Pennsylvania will benefit from the expanded child tax credit. Mr. Chairman, I want to commend Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Neal for working together to advance policies for all Americans. Thank you, and I yield back.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Tinney.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a small business owner for a long time in upstate New York, I join my colleagues today in supporting H.R. 7024, the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act. This comprehensive package was shaped by critical feedback that we received from everyday Americans across this nation through field hearings conducted by the Ways and Means Committee. H.R. 7024 will have a meaningful impact on my constituents in upstate New York, way up in New York's 24th district, from hardworking families to manufacturers to multi-generational family farms, and the largest agricultural district in the Northeast. This package will have wide-ranging benefits for so many Americans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, the ranking member, Mr. Nill, for 30 seconds.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard the arguments here. This is what's possible. And despite what some have said here, this does expand the child tax credit. It's clear. No legislation that comes to this floor is perfect. We tried very hard, and we succeeded on the Democratic side in improving this legislation. So what's in front of us tonight is pretty simple. 16 million children will benefit from the improvement to the child tax credit. That's a fact.
Does the gentleman from Missouri reserve?
Reserve.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I inquire to the time remaining.
The gentleman has 1 3/4 minutes.
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I'm prepared to close. And
the gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, and I want to reiterate my appreciation of all those who worked on this bill, and the Ways and Means Committee, my friend Mr. Smith from Missouri. There's a lot of good provisions in this bill, many of which I support. There's provisions in there, the expensing provisions, interest, R&D. These are good provisions to help economic growth. But I have serious reservations. And the fact of the matter is, for all those watching at home, to my constituents, this bill does not fix the problem that allows illegal aliens who have children that were born in the United States to claim the tax credit. So that takes the problem we have with so-called birthright citizenship and anchor babies and doubles down on it, makes it worse. That was a mistake in 2017. We should rectify that mistake. But then worse, it goes on and expands the credit. 91.5% of the relief in this bill are cash welfare payments to families that pay no federal income taxes. It provides a total of just $2.8 billion to working families that pay taxes over 3 years. The fact is, the credit does expand, and it gets to be refundable to the full tune of $2,000 by 2025. These provisions undermine the benefits that we're trying to provide for economic growth, which I might add are only a 2-year extension. It puts all of this in one big basket in 2025, taking away any leverage we're going to have by giving the other side what they want on the child tax credit. The fact of the matter is, we should not be supporting this bill. We should be doing what we said we would do when we got into power. We should secure the border of the United States. We should cut spending, and we should honor what we campaign on in this body. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to confirm for my colleagues that this bill preserves existing safeguards of the child tax credit and does not open the door for illegal immigrants to claim the credit. No other tax credit or deduction can match the child tax credit's protections from improper claims combined with safeguards against payments to non-U.S. citizens. Mr. Speaker, this is a win for millions of small businesses. a win for millions of working families. This is a win for America. I urge the body to support this great piece of legislation.
The gentleman yields back. Time has expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill